Okay, so we probably will have a couple of people still coming in if Corian or Brittany Ray, I don't know if you are able to kind of help monitor the waiting room a little bit. Or I can just take that out, which I just did. So people that are coming in are going to be able to join us as they come in, which is great. Okay, well, welcome everyone that is here. We're so glad to have you. This is our September webinar focused on broadband affordability. Recently, Corianne, Zacher, and myself released our most recent report, Broadband Affordability, the metrics that drive and divide us. And so we're here to kind of talk about that today. Some of the broader pictures of affordability in the broadband landscape, but also some of the results and key findings that we've seen in some of our data collection, and then some recommendations that we have moving forward. As always, we love to have participation from our webinars. Please join in the chat. Use the raising hand feature, and we would love to hear from you. We also have a section at the end for questions if you have any as they're lingering. We also have an opportunity, one of the last slides that you can, it's a QR code that you can use to take a picture and open up the report for yourself. If you have access to our monthly webinars, you may have already had access to this report. Either way, we're so glad that you're here with us today, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So again, my name is Stacy Baxter. I'm the program manager, and I was so happy to support my coworker in this project and allow them to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Corianne Zacher, and Stacy was an awesome partner in the project. I feel like support is not an adequate word to say how much you did, so have to shout that out. And yeah, we're just really excited to be sharing about our research today. And Stacy, I love hearing about your background because it's so interesting and I feel like so fresh for this space.
Thank you.
So just to kind of get started, I see we have a few of our members in the chat. And really, I wanted to start off by saying that this project was very much member driven. If you haven't had a chance to check out the earlier iteration of this project, it was our state broadband policy map. So we heard from members that they really wanted resources on their state and what broadband looked like, and especially with the BEAD program and all of the new state programs that have come up and the Digital Equity Act. We really wanted to make sure that there was a one-stop place where people could get resources for their community. So that was our goal with the map. And then once we had put this map together, we had all these awesome data points that you can see along the bottom of the one-pagers. And there's a one-pager for every state and the 5 territories on the screen, and then DC as well. So if you haven't had a chance to check those out, those were kind of what started this project. And then we really wanted to take a look at some of the outliers, because we hear a lot that, and Stacy will get into the background, there's been a ton of awesome research on the relationship between poverty and internet access, but we really wanted to look at some of these outliers that were sticking out as we put together the one-pagers. And what I mean by that is places where poverty and internet access didn't align. So places that there were either a lot of people who had access that went way above the poverty line, and then places where even people who were making incomes much above the poverty line didn't have access. So we wanted to kind of dig into those and see what they had in common, to see if there were any best practices that we could pull from that. So I think we're ready for the next slide. And yeah, Stacy, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine. Yeah, so like Corianne was saying, it came out of a labor of love and looking at our members and kind of how can we help fill the gaps in certain areas. And one of the important ways to do that, along with hearing from our local leaders and our municipalities, is to look at what the lit review or literature is already saying. And so we already know through a lot of literature in the past decade that there's a strong connection between low income households and having less access to the internet, no matter geographic location, age, and race. So that is true across all of those variants. And so when we think about what that means, we understand that the connection between those who do not have access to the internet and those who are falling below the poverty line is a strong correlation. And like Corianne was saying, we know that that trend is true. And so when we were looking at this data, we really wanted to see what is going on in the outliers that can kind of break apart that trend or make the areas that need some support get the access to the resources and the kind of the pathways and the secret sauce to make that happen. So the literature, unfortunately, for this correlation between low-income households and lack of internet access or lack of access to a device, this is true for both pre and post-pandemic numbers. So really that a lot of resources went into helping people have access to internet service and to devices during the pandemic, but we see those numbers are steady when it comes to low-income households. So for us, this really reiterates the fact that broadband affordability is a main barrier for connectivity. We hear a lot about infrastructure, or we hear from certain ISPs, people don't want internet connection. They don't want to be connected to the internet. But really, from what we hear from our members and what the literature is saying, affordability really is the key factor that prevents people from being able to access the internet or have a device from home. And I'm really excited about our report because we do kind of factor in the bigger picture of affordability. So when we talk about costs of living and the extreme increases that we've seen recently, we also want to factor in average internet service. And in our report, that you'll see that when they talk about monthly budgeting or income for a family, and they list out all of the pieces that should be a factor in your income, internet is not on there. It is not listed as a line item. So you're talking an average price being about $90 to $100 a month. And that's not even listed on a lot of income budgets when we're talking about what is affordability in other aspects of our lives, not just talking about broadband. So really encourage you to take a look at the report, see some of the information we're sharing about affordability and other aspects, and how does broadband fit into that when we know it's so important. We know that people need access, and affordability is a main barrier in getting to fill those gaps. So in our research, our methodology, we looked at two sets of data. So American Community Survey data that showed us all 50 states, District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. And then we used 2020 census data to look at American Samoa and Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, and Virgin Islands. We will say that some of that data was not as available when we're looking at smaller population sizes, but we wanted to make an effort to make sure that we looked at U.S. territories, that we looked at smaller locations, places, so we could talk about data in a bigger scale. And then again, when we look at our lit review, we talk about connections between low-income households and lack of internet, lack of a digital device, and then some data on poverty levels and costs of living. We talk about rent, childcare, groceries, health insurance, car payments, and what's not on that list is broadband. So how does that fit into our monthly budget of our families, of our students who are going to college and have very short budgets that they're working with? Or when we talk about our aging populations and our seniors who have fixed incomes, and what does broadband affordability look like for them? And how does that factor into their lack of access?
And like Stacey was saying, so there were quite a few communities that went into this with the data, and for most of them, especially with the states, you could really see that 100% of them were within like the poverty rate and the percent of people without internet access were within 5% of each other. So they were very closely correlated. And the communities that we look at that we'll really dig into in our report and later in the presentation, these are communities that the difference was more than 10%. So either the percent of residents without internet was 10% more than the percent of residents in poverty, or the other way around. So there was a very large gap, especially compared to other communities where it was so closely correlated. We saw really tight correlations in a lot of communities between internet access and poverty. And so we wanted to see what that was about. So our assumption going into it was that those communities where there were lots of people who didn't have access, even those who weren't living in poverty, our assumption was that internet is really expensive. And I think that, sorry, I'm not sure what the next slide is, but the next slide might help illustrate that. Yes, okay. So we noticed that the communities where access was a lot higher than poverty, so there were lots of people living below the poverty line, but they did have internet access at home. Some of the common things we noticed were that they had a major university, or that they had a municipal broadband network. And this kind of aligned with things we were hearing from our members that inspired this research in the first place, which is during the pandemic, municipal networks weren't cutting off people's access if they weren't able to pay because they lost their job. The universities were stepping outside of their footprint to connect neighborhoods nearby, and were having a positive impact on the community. So we sort of expected to see some of this, and the data really confirmed that. And then similarly for the communities where poverty exceeded access, those were the places where we assumed that internet was super expensive. And we found a lot of overlaps with these are places that are very far from community metro areas. They were the ones that were geographically remote, were usually a territory, or they were on the very outside border of a state. We ended up overlaying the data for rural areas with a map from the USDA. And it was actually really interesting to see that all of those places were on the outside border of the state. So potentially just very unserved compared to where the rest of the state lives. And then also they were very much not metro areas, very low population density. So again, that was kind of what we expected to see, but then we also overlaid that information with FCC data about what services were available, and found those places were more likely to have not no competition, especially on the wireline side. That they were really likely to only have maybe satellite or some sort of wireless solution that doesn't always, even though it's advertised on the FCC map, that doesn't always mean that someone can subscribe to it. So those were some things that stood out to us. And you will see that we edited this slide. If you looked at the earlier version of the findings during this presentation, I did remember what the greater than 10% meant. It was that it's greater than 10% the difference between poverty rate and internet access rate, but I think this makes a little more sense, so we simplified this slide. So the on the left side, these are the communities that we were just talking about, where percent in poverty really exceeds percent without internet. Those were the high poverty areas. And then, oh, I think one typo we did make on this slide is that rural actually, no, this is right. Sorry, the high poverty areas and the colleges and community networks are areas where there were people in poverty who had access to internet. And then whenever we dug into that, as you'll see in the report, we did find more affordable offerings, especially for colleges, that some providers had special rates for college students that were significantly cheaper. For community networks, it was similar. And I know there's been a lot of other research on pricing of municipal networks, but we found that the pricing was transparent, so we were actually able to find it by going to the website without having to enter a service address and pretend to be buying service. We were able to see the price, and it was typically more affordable than usually like $60 is what we hear from members as in terms of a competitive rate overall for a community. So that's like not an affordable rate, but just what a good ideal rate would be for competitive services overall. So we found that those communities that service was being offered at those lower prices. And if you dig into the report, I think it is on page 17 that we kind of go into that for university communities. And then we did something similar for municipal networks. And then similar with the other side of the coin is that there are lots of people who are not living below the poverty line who seem to not be able to afford internet in very rural communities, like those places that I mentioned that are on the very outside border of a state. They're very far from big metro areas, and then also US territories, which often get left out of this data collection. Like Stacy mentioned in the beginning, there were a lot of challenges we wanted to include them in this report because they're included in BEAD, and also we think that they are very important. We would love to know what sort of progress territories are making, because we know there's lots of community initiatives going on, and we want to see how that progress is going. But the American Census data that or American Community Survey data that we used for the rest of states and communities wasn't available for all of the territories. So you'll see in the report we got some of that data for Puerto Rico, but it was harder for Guam, American Samoa, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the Virgin Islands. So we used census data instead, which we just uh, personally and professionally, I think would love to see that data improved, so that territories are included in the American Community Survey so that they can get comparable data to other states and communities. And you can see it in the recommendations finding, which we will get into at a high level, but a big chunk of our recommendations are about improving data collection so that we can do better research on this field in the future. And and just to kind of use high poverty communities as an example, this was sort of, we had a bigger version of this in a spreadsheet that had all of the 278 communities, and then a separate tab for the states and territories. So this kind of gives you an idea of what we were looking at when we were collecting this research. And so we looked at population, percent without internet, percent of residents in poverty, and then, of course, the difference between the two. And as you can see with these high poverty communities, that difference is very high, 27% in Ponce, Puerto Rico, 24.2 in Carbondale, Illinois. So these were these are very big deviations. So that was one thing that drew us to this research, was that so many communities there, that difference is zero. And so these really stuck out to us as, if a community is 25, if there's 25% difference between percent of residents without internet and percent of residents in poverty, we really want to understand what's going on there. And then similarly, I don't know that we need to go through all of the details. I got really excited when we were doing the data analysis, so happy to dig into some of this offline if anyone is curious or has ideas for us, because we are definitely interested in comparing this over time. So doing the same analysis, but with the new data sets that have been released, and we haven't even had a chance to look into with all of the awesome data that's come out through NTIA in the past few weeks. So that is next on our list. But thank you all so much for listening to all of this. And then Stacy, I know that next this was the rural slide I was talking about earlier. Sorry that I said that so out of order, but this was the USDA map that I mentioned, that we wanted to overlay those communities that there was the most deviation. So we charted those out, and as you can see, they're just, all of them are pretty far away from the state's metro areas. They're often on the edge of the state, so they're just, we assume there were not as many resources for most of these people. And then some of them that were more that seemed more urban, whenever we started to look into the level of access, there just wasn't as much access on the availability side. So we assume that affordability is also an issue there, even though that information isn't as easily available through the FCC right now.
Yeah, and there's a lot of of data here, so we really encourage you to take a look at the report, read for yourself, kind of get an idea. As Corianne was saying, in a lot of these areas, we're seeing that line kind of be a steady correlation between those without access and those that fall below the poverty line. So we want to know, what is it that's working in these high poverty areas where we're seeing people, a lot of people that are falling below the poverty line, but we have a lot of people with access to internet at home. What's working? And we shouldn't really have to have people be at extremes of poverty to be able to get connected to internet service at home. So it's both trying to figure out what is working, and then how do we make that in a broader scale to work for everybody. So it's important to look at the outliers. We want to continue to do that research. But our recommendations, I think far and large, but also, you know, when it comes to our local communities, is to fund affordable internet. We know there's a lot of legislation out there for the Affordable Connectivity Program extension. Hasn't seen a lot of traction recently, but we want to continue to fight for affordable connectivity. And we know that that was a program that over 23 million families signed up for. And that was only a small percentage of those that were even eligible to enroll in the program. So we know it's important and that it works. We want to encourage digital equity coalitions. That's something that Next Century Cities is going to be working on as an organization along with our members to kind of go along with the state broadband policy map that has some resources for you. We want to encourage more resources and guides to be available to talk about what is working and share that love with everybody. And then we also want to highlight the importance of local autonomy, knowing that community members and community leaders are their experts in their own lives, and that individuals are experts in their own lives. They know what is keeping them from getting access to the internet. And when they say it's affordability, to really listen to that and drive that forward. Another recommendation that we see is really important in data collection, and we know that data collection drives policy along with storytelling and qualitative data. But we want to include territories in this data collection. We want to make sure that other organizations are not overlooking our U.S. territories, even though that data might be a little harder to collect. We want to expand our sample sizes, include smaller local governments, collect neighborhood data on even smaller scales than we see now. And then as well, we want to be able to update definitions in our data so that we can all have an idea of what is acceptable speeds of internet, right? And be able to hold fast on those definitions. Our last recommendation that we made is just to invest in infrastructure. We know that infrastructure and affordability kind of do go hand in hand in a lot of places, and middle mile networks there has been a lot of success there. We do see success in mapping, and we know that challenging mapping is really important. And throughout the speed process, that has been some of the things that we've tried to be able to support with. So as Corianne said, this is not where our research ends. It's never the case for research, but we want to continue to look at data over time. How has ACP impacted these numbers? How has new data points that Corianne was talking about with NTIA releasing some more data? What does this say for existing numbers that we have, and what is really working? So as promised, this is the QR code for you to take a little snapshot and to take a read of the report. It's not a super long report. We hope that it is a easy read for you, but also something that you can hold on to, kind of reference in community meetings, in meetings with your local officials, and really push for that affordability, because we know it is the main barrier. So we do want to open it up. We have a couple of minutes for questions and or comments. If you feel that you would like to be brave enough to share, we really encourage sharing. We love that. So Corianne, thank you for dropping the link in the chat as well to the paper if you don't have access to your cell phone. But feel free to drop a question in the chat, come off mute, raise your hand. We would love to hear from you about maybe data we haven't collected that you're wondering about. So we would love to open that up to our guests today.
Hey guys, this is Brenda Leeser. Since no one else is biting, I'm with Common Sense Media. Really interesting report. We've actually been looking into very similar things recently on our end. You had mentioned, this is earlier on in the presentation, that you had determined the average internet cost of incorporating the cost of living to be $90 a month. Do you have that data analyzed by a state or a more micro level, or do you just have it for the national level?
I believe that we only have it for the national level. I know that all of the data points that we mentioned in our report are cited, and so that information is there. Unless Corianne knows differently, I believe that information we really have on a national scale. But I think getting it, again, to your point, getting it on a local scale would help us define that a little bit more.
Yeah, at least in our conversations with people on the Hill, different advocates, obviously they tend to be more swayed by localized numbers that they can, relate to how their constituents are being impacted specifically. So that's something that we're looking forward to. So I didn't know if you guys had already put it together, but either way, really great report.
Thank you so much for your question. And that's something that we agree with, that we want to, whatever is going to push the needle. So whatever data points are necessary, we want to know more about it. So thank you for that. And that's something that I would love to know personally. And really also kind of looking at what does that national number look at if those local numbers look to be really different, and what are the implications there? Thank you so much. Well, if we don't
I'll
have any,
jump in.
go ahead, please. Thank you.
I'll jump in a quick question. Yeah. So based off of this research, I know you just presented this at TPRC as well in DC this last week. So what are some of the things you're thinking about next? Now, we've talked about this as a group a little bit, but what are some things you think about next to research to expand this work?
I loved Brenna's question. So that has me thinking about how can we get some data points from our local members that we know about, any numbers that they might have on average costs of internet service at home, or average costs of devices that they may have at home. I know Corey Ann's really interested in the data coming back from NCIA and what some of the affordable programs in these areas, have they swayed numbers? Has that data shifted at all? Corey Ann, I don't know if you had any other thoughts.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm also thinking about the state side of things, because I feel like this time we really focused on the local side and what local programs looked like, and how those were impacting numbers. But I'd love to dig into states. I feel like we lean toward the communities because um, like what was just being said about the local data points are really like helpful in telling a story, and that was what we were hearing from members. But I think the next iteration of this, especially for understanding the policy implications, is what are states doing, like especially since they have so much money to award, who are they giving that money to, and how is that going to impact affordability, is sort of the question I have for the next like 5 or 10 years. I don't think that will be answered in our next report, but that's what I'm excited to see in the long term.
Yeah, because we know that that data will help us figure out if more money will come down the path. So that's super important. Well, again, thank you all for joining us today. Our webinars are always recorded, so look to YouTube if you want to come back on some of the things that we talked about today. Please take a read at our report, or join us next month in October during Digital Inclusion Week. We are having a webinar with Communication Services for the Deaf, talking about broadband accessibility, specifically direct video calling for communities who are deaf and hard of hearing. So that'll be next Thursday, October 10th at 12 p.m. We really look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you all for coming. And please, as always, reach out if you need anything, have questions, comments, or want to partner with anything in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.